All right, so once again, this is Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties of Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And once again, this is Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December Declaration toward the Destruction of Democracy, to which we have been adding in America, for clarification's sake. And if you're following along with our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristotle's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of the Sphinx in Aristophanes, or the story of the Sphinx, the story of Oedipus, and perhaps also the story of the Sphinx in a certain sense. Aristophanes, the smile of the Sphinx, certainly spends more time investigating, the life and motivations of the Sphinx than any other example of classical literature that I'm aware of. And that doesn't mean that there aren't other examples of classical literature that spend more time than Aristophanes does revealing the details and psychological motivations. Both, one could say, the story and the narrative, in the sense that those two functions are defined separately and distinctly in David Antin's construction of them. It's not to say that there are no other examples of classical literature that don't spend more time committed to the revelation of details regarding either the story or the narrative of the life of the Sphinx, diarmenia aCiPhtTh, and story and narrative, those two being distinguished in the sense that David Antin distinguishes them. But it is to say that there are no examples of classical literature which spend more time concerning themselves with or investigating or examining either the story or the narrative of the life of diarmenia aCiPhtTh that I am currently aware of. And so we could say that and the fact that this play of Aristophanes is titled The Smile of the Sphinx suggests perhaps as much that in addition to referring to those moments in which that after image, right, of the smile of the Sphinx, that after image of the Cheshire cat-like smile of the Sphinx that is retained on the what are they, cones and rods, right, of the retina's memory, right, of the retina's memory. In addition to referencing that particular moment and whatever that particular moment signifies within the dream of Tiresias, the title is perhaps a suggestion that the way that Aristophanes wants to tell this story is really as much about the Sphinx, that is diarmenia aCiPhtTh, as it is about Oedipus. And perhaps it suggests that the real hero in this comic version of the story of Oedipus, which is where I was going with that line when I made the error to say, the story of Oedipus, as Aristophanes, right, reads, elaborates, and interprets the story of Oedipus. But I had made that error, and that error, produced, a consideration of of who the real hero of this comedy is, and you know, if it is in fact, you know, diarmenia aCiPhtTh, then the significance of the action which unfolds in this scene that, you know, we're leading up to discussing, Act 2, Scene 3, in which Oedipus and Laius, you know, and Laius's entourage confront one another at the tripleus amoxitois and struggle and engage in what Eric Havelock, you know, referred to as action in the I think, you know, he referred to as, you know, simplistic masculinist Joseph Campbell sense of action, the action hero, right? The Drasi, you know, per se. If the Sphinx is the real, you know, heroic subject of this comedy, then this moment, you know, at the crossroads is not in fact the is not in fact the central, you know, pivotal fulcrum for the unfolding. But I suppose, you know, what would be the central, in terms of the Drasi, what would be the central, you know, pivotal scene in terms of the life of the Sphinx and the story of diarmenia aCiPhtTh, would be Act 3, you know, Scene 2. So that is, you know, perhaps something to keep in mind, and it certainly, you know, wouldn't have been, you know, placed in mind, or I certainly wouldn't have even begun, you know, to consider it, you know, had I not made that, you know, in this instance, you know, relatively, you know, trivial error, referring to these levels, right, of reading, elaboration, and interpretation, in which I ended with Aristophanes, and you know, quoting myself. I ended with quoting myself. Aristophanes reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of the Sphinx, and what I had intended to say was Aristophanes reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus. And so, you know, again, this is not intended to be, you know, notes towards a metapoetics of the exploration of errorful learning processes. But if it were, you know, this digression would be, you know, particularly relevant. As a metapoetics of Paranarratology, it touches upon the processes of errorful learning, because, you know, because error can be seen as an instance of paranarrative, and it can be seen as an instance of paranarrative, you know, for a number of reasons. From a Freudian point of view, if one regards error as motivated by unconscious desires, it's clear that all errors, you know, point toward narratives that involve desire, right? Either desire or anxiety. And that was clear in our examination of the grand piano, and of this character, you know, played by Elijah Wood, and the anxiety, right, that influences, you know, his ability to play this piece, the Sanquet, and how that anxiety or that and anxiety is a kind of, allegory of teleiasis, of completion, perfection, the muse of perfection and completion and perfection. Gets played out in this this bizarre set of transmogrifications, right? That create this weird sort of detective story, conspiracy style plot. But how that's motivated, perhaps by like these unconscious, this working toward the surface of the strange manifestations that the motivation, to perform this teleiasis of perfection and completion, can manifest as one could say monsters of the mind, or what's the line from William Blake, breeds reptiles of the mind, right? And so perhaps the teleiasis can do this, and it seems that the grand piano plays out those reptiles of the mind that are produced by such a motivation. And in any case, looked at from a number of different perspectives, the intrusion of error gives if one allows oneself to engage it, gives rise to a lot of different aspects of story and narrative, or one could say from a different perspective. Inherently, right, and inherently contains elements of narrative, as David Antin defines narrative, and can give rise to story if the narrating subject allows herself or himself or themselves to pursue those errors. And so from the Freudian perspective, if we imagine that an error such as parapraxis or parapraxia is truly, psychologically motivated and begins from some place in a relationship to either desire, the desire of the unconscious to reveal itself to consciousness, or anxiety, the anxiety that the unconscious has that it will be revealed, as seems to be the case in the grand piano, and looked at from that point of view, the character Tom, played by Elijah Wood in the grand piano, the anxiety of error, can be seen, perhaps as a stand-in, for the anxiety of all sorts of revealings, right, of himself and his secrets, and his, whether those secrets are secret desires or secret fears that he doesn't care to reveal, either to himself or as it's played out in this film, an audience, right, an audience of those who have an aesthetic taste for classical music, and this muse who's one of whose trajectories, at least, is completion and error-free performance, right? Teleiasis, and so, from a Freudian perspective, error is inherently, narrative, right? Because it's always already related to desire and or anxiety, and from the point of view, a different point of view, from the point of view of someone who has a disability that produces error, or that occupies a positionality in which cognitive processes are completed in a different manner, and that different manner of completion is perceived by others as error, and that the production of those errors in any kind of performance, or any kind of relatively unself-conscious and performance not subjected to continual re-examination and ongoing correction that would slow down, right, like communication, and perhaps even stifle it completely, right? So suppose that you're a dyslexic, and you're struggling to get through this text, and you're reading it aloud in the course of your struggle to decode it, right? And you're constantly interrupted by someone supervising you and correcting every single mistake. In addition to the struggle of getting through the text and the relationship that you have in the problems of decoding, and then the decodings, and then following, like, the struggle with decoding, having to additionally interpret the text that you're reading, that already is a big struggle and problem. And then imagine being constantly interrupted, either by a voice that comes from within, in the sense of the self-editor or the self-corrector, or from outside, demanding that at every moment in the decoding process that you produce this sort of perfection. Well, in instances such as that, you can imagine that you're effectively, your ability, to read and decode and decipher and following that, to express, is effectively, silenced, right? So such stories are inherently narrative. And so whether one takes error from this Freudian psychological point of view as motivated by the unconscious, or whether one imagines that that certain kinds of errors are functions, right, of differences in one's cognitive positionality, there are always social ramifications for such differences in positionality, and those consequences are inherently narrative, right? So if this were, if this were, instead of being a notes toward a metapoetics of paranarratology, if it were instead, notes toward a metapoetics of the processes of errorful learning, this particular digression would seem, extraordinarily, relevant to that unfolding. But even as it is, because we've been discussing difficulties in remembering, right, in remembering the solution sets to those various riddles of the Sphinx, and we've been talking about differences in the way that oral cultures organize tellings and memory from those literate cultures, right, that organize knowledge entirely differently, and that we've also brought in Eric A. Havelock to perform, Eric, we should say Eric Havelock brought himself into our dreams to in a certain way correct some of our errors that we've been making and continue to make, because we've failed, right, to look up the details on the web, and what few books we have are packed, because we're moving, and And then, beyond that, our library is very limited because, we've lost our library so many times because we've had to move, and all of that, relates to these economic circumstances and limited resources and limited means that themselves are, results of social conditions that are, if not overdetermined, right, by positionalities that involve, relationships to cognitive difference, are certainly partially determined by those. So all of that history is another, story that that can be woven, out of like this discourse on error, and in that sense, it very much belongs to notes toward a metapoetics of Paranarratology, and we certainly wouldn't have gotten there had I not stated as I did Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of the life of the Sphinx, rather than the life of Oedipus. But beyond that, and returning, to this idea of where we are and how we want to formulate that, whether we want to formulate that we are at the climax, right, of the action in this meeting, between this escaping stranger, right, who's escaping his destiny, taking the road to Thebes, and this jealous tyrant, on his way to encounter this young man who threatens Leia's position in so many complex and complicated ways. But if we imagine that the real story, lies elsewhere, or thinking, paranarratologically, perhaps the more interesting story in the story of the mother telling a story, the working mother telling a story to her child or children before they go to bed, lies, not so much in the fairy tale or the fable or the folk story that she chooses, but lies in the intention for telling the story to her children in the first place, and what leaks into the telling of that story that reveals something of herself or of her relationship to her children, or something that belongs either to her past or to the fantasy that she has for her future, or the fantasy that she has for the future of those children. And perhaps in the same way, or in a similar or analogous way, the story that Aristophanes tells isn't about the action or the drosy of Oedipus at the crossroads, but perhaps it's about the relationships that the other characters who are aware of the unfolding of these actions as a plot, and the significance, right, of these actions as they unfold in relationship to the health and well-being of the community maybe it's about, the choices and decisions that those characters make. And if that's the case, the story isn't essentially about either Laius or about Oedipus. And if David Antin, we're narrating this part of the discussion, which he's not. This is still ours, as you will recall. But he would say, in the same way, David perhaps he would, perhaps he wouldn't, but perhaps David, because we've discerned this as a pattern in the way that he moves, back and forth between Aristophanes' telling and the events as they unfold in his future, in the future that belongs to this period between 2016 and 2024. Perhaps he would say, so that the real narrative isn't about either Ron DeSantis or the subject, right? The subject of the story. Or what we have to look for. We can't look for narrativity, he might say, in the mind of someone like Ron DeSantis or of Donald Trump, who are incapable of anything other than looking surprised, and he does the surprise thing and then he shrugs it off. But perhaps we have to look for it elsewhere, in someone, in that period of time and the actions that that they take and implement as a strategy to save our democracy, or how they might go about living in this world in which your only options seem to be Oedipus or Laius. So you're looking for a narrative elsewhere, and David, might say, in the story as it unfolds in Aristophanes' telling, in this comedy, The Smile of the Sphinx, the characters, to look for that narrativity in relationship to aren't Laius and Oedipus, even though that's the way that Sophocles does it. But we're really looking for narrative in the sense that I define it, David might say, in characters like Tiresias and Diarmenia Sheshapunk, the Sphinx. And the Sphinx seems like an unlikely character to look for narrative in, right? If that's where the psychological narrative really lies, then this incident which occurs at the crossroads, and he would say crossroads, he wouldn't say the tripleus amoxitoas, is really just a kind of an example of the drosy that creates the excuse for Oedipus to move on to that place, in which the real heart of the narrative occurs, which is in the decision, right? In the decisions that Diarmenia Sheshapunk makes in determining, whether he is to move forward in his course on his journey to Thebes, or whether she'll destroy him. And so the real narrative lies, in her relationship as guardian figure of the road, David might say, and her self-understanding, right, as this kind of intellectual, intelligent, verbal artist, who utilizes these riddles, and she has a commitment to honoring, right? Honoring the contract involved in playing out this language game. There's a certain amount of truth that it has, and she has a certain amount of self-investment that she's made in the legitimacy of this game, as honest and fair. Like, she doesn't cheat, David might say. And it's the heart of the narrative, in the sense that I define narrative of this story, then, becomes a matter of how she manages the cognitive dissonance of this sense of self as a judge, and fair, right? And a performer in this kind of intellectual competition, that demands a certain amount of honesty and integrity, and then this obligation that she has in relationship to the terms that were set, in her discussion with Tiresias, and maybe maybe David might say, maybe the smile is really a distraction. Maybe it's not so much like, the clever smile of the Sphinx, but it's almost like, the frown of the Sphinx. But that part is hidden, right? It's hidden in the title, under, masked under the smile, like in the idea that when you tell a joke, you're telling it from a place in which you've been hurt, but you mask it, with a smile. And he says, maybe that is where the narrative is. So and he says, I said he says, but he might have said, the idea of this smile, like that you can't see if you're walking into the comedy, but it's only there, only there as after image on the rods and cones of the retinas of those individuals who have seen this bright light, right, and within this duration in which the smiling Sphinx's teeth are what produce the light for the stage in Tiresias's dream, in the dream of Tiresias as it's represented in the stage, right? That idea of like visibility and invisibility that gets played out in Tiresias's dream obviously is very important to Aristophanes' understanding of what these meanings are. And it suggests that there's, a wealth of meanings beneath this, David might say. All right, so that's all speculative, but returning, from that, returning from that, minor error and whatever we generated, through through our ability, like, to see error as motivating us, toward a meaning, rather than to see error as something to be, avoided, as we've referred to it, errorful learning. Moving on, from there and back out of this, if it is a digression, out of this digression. That's where we are, Act 2, Scene 3, and whether it's the climax, a certain way of the piece, because the piece is about or if it's not climax, but motivating change of fortune, one could say, if when, like the way that Aristotle constructs the anagnoreikos and Parapeteia is as if it were a moment. But in a way, it's a for Oedipus, you could say the Parapeteia, it is an extended, period or duration within the organization of time in the story. And if one wanted to see it that way, you could see it as like having an inception, at the murder of his father, and then you could say it has a terminus at the understanding that of the crimes that he's committed, which aren't really crimes because he didn't know that he was committing them, but of these violations and breakings of sacred taboos, right? You could say that, that the terminus of that duration, occurs when he realizes that he's killed his father and that he's murdered his mother, and that's not until the end of the story as it's presented in Sophocles, right? But as it's constructed in Aristotle, it's constructed entirely around like the self-understanding. So if you construct it that way, clearly Oedipus is the subject of narrative, in the sense of coming to knowledge of oneself and the threats that knowledge brings to the subject, that might be retreating from it or advancing toward it, or doing both at the same time, right? And but if wanted to look at it, from a different point of view, Oedipus's fortune really changes, at that moment in the Tripleus of Moxitoas, and in that sense, you could say the reversal, right? From the point of view of a set of actions, occurs in that moment, not in the moment of the revelation. Because prior to the commitment to the action, prior to the commitment to the drasi, he hasn't fulfilled the terms that were laid out by the oracle, regarding his fate. And but at the crossroads, he's committed an action. He's committed himself, right, to the fulfillment of the prophecy, and it's no longer a potentiality. So in a sense, the reversal of fortune has already occurred. He just fails to be aware of it. You can't say that it hasn't occurred. You can say that his relationship, to it as self-understanding hasn't occurred yet. But whether we see that moment, right, as the significant moment, of the narrative unfolding, or whether we see it in more, or whether we see in this story a more complicated, understanding of, both that domain of actions and events, which can't be controlled, and those those choices that are made by characters like Tiresias and the Sphinx, who are not committed, right, to the unfolding of these particular sets of fates in any direction, one way or the other, but can make legitimate choices, and the significance of those choices are defined, right, by their senses of self-understanding and the options that are available to them in terms of those self-understandings, so that are inherently narrative. But once again, let's return from the digression and begin. One could say at the beginning of Act 2, Scene 3, and how it unfolds. And just before doing that, I'll say one more thing that could be regarded as digressive, which is that today, in revealing the story, I want to focus on, if I can, on the movement of David's hands, rather than on the movement of rather than on David as talking head. And the reason that I want to do that is by special request of we'll just say by special request of space-time travel communication coordinate 1619, and or space-time travel communication coordinate 1916, and these coordinates were provided for me today, this morning, and we've talked about, the indeterminacy of communication using the space. We've talked about the indeterminacy of using any kind of communication that can be read ambiguously, right? Either as an intentionality or as an accident, because these numbers, may reflect, right, intentional acts of communication, or may reflect arbitrary phenomenon, and that's another subject and another topic that we're interested in engaging, and but here, without exploring, those ambiguities and complexities, right, that observation as communication, gives rise to. Let's just say, by request of space-time travel communication coordinate 1619 and/or 1916, that we're interested in, communicating back a response, and that response is, focusing on David's, gestural use of his hands today, rather than, the facial expressions that he makes as he's providing this, discourse. All right, then. As David defines it for us once again here, and describes it for us once again here, the stage is divided in half in this particular scene, Act 2, Scene 3. And on one side of the stage, which is divided in half, and which has, that unfolding backdrop, which helps us to understand that as this landscape changes, the character that's presented on the stage is moving in space and time, and we understand this because on one side of the stage, Oedipus is presented on a road, and he's fully armored, which is interesting, David says, because it's perhaps not what we expected. But he's fully armored, and he's walking on this path, and the backdrop that's unfolding, behind him, explains to us, where he is, and additionally, we know where he is because there's a road sign, and that road sign says, "This way to the Tripleus amoxitois," and David doesn't say this way to the Tripleus amoxitois. David says this way to the crossroads, but we'll just say this way to the Tripleus amoxitois, and on the other side of the stage, which is divided, and which also has an unfolding backdrop, and which also has a road sign which states this way to the Tripleus amoxitois, but is pointing in the opposite direction, so that the vectors of the two, road signs, the directions that they point to, are pointing toward one another, and we understand that as these scenes are depicted on this stage, David explains the character of Oedipus, and the characters, representing Laius and his entourage. Laius is in his chariot, and his entourage is running behind him. Of course, the movement of the chariot and the chariot wheels spin and rumble, and there's quite a bit of noise. And the actors playing the part of the runners, are apparently running, but they're not moving on the actual stage space, right? They're running in place, and the chariot is, driving on in place. But we know, that they're moving because the backdrop is once again unfolding in the direction toward the tripleus amoxitois, which David refers to as the crossroads. And the three, chosen winners of the various races of the stadion and the two-stage race and the dolichos, these vary, from performance to performance, as we've already said, and David mentions that, once again, that whether it's the moth, the butterfly, the frog, the dog twice run over by the chariot, the fly tortured by the naughty boy, the amoeba, the millipede, the centipede, the ordinary human, or the king, whoever these or whoever else, might have won their particular race. They're there, and they're of course naked, and as is Laius, according to the plan, right? Devised the plan or the plot, that is the as Eric Havelock would say, and David doesn't refer to Eric Havelock here, but we will stepping out of David's discourse for a moment, as Eric Havelock refers to them, belonging to the schedio, right? And the schedio that represented, or at least according to Eric, that was represented in Act 2, Scene 2, and that we are now engaging in the drosy that is the result, right, of all of these implementations of the schedio, and so according to the plans of the schedio, the winners of those races were selected as the entourage for this particular event, in which the plan is to do away with Oedipus, before he reaches Thebes, and to do away with them at the tripleus amoxitois. And once again, David refers to the crossroads as the crossroads. But we've developed a predilection for referring to those crossroads in the original Greek, and perhaps because the name contributes to one or more of our arguments concerning the symbolic significance of this place. So we'll perhaps continue to refer to the tripleus amoxitois, whether David refers to it as the crossroads or otherwise. Although we may variously refer to this place as Daulis toward Delphi and the tripleus or the tripleus amoxitois. So on this side, in which this chariot is noisily driving onward, and behind which these three naked runners are struggling to keep up, and occasionally David explains that occasionally on this side of the stage the chariot will stop and apparently wait for the now to perform this. David says the actors have to be particularly skilled because the actors have to look like they're running forward, and certainly the backdrop or the set that's unfolding in the backdrop helps this representation along, and it creates the illusion that both the chariot and the runners, are moving forward. But the runners need to represent, at various moments in this scene, they need to suggest that they're falling behind the chariot, and this is, the visual representation that they're falling behind the chariot is, of course, the motivation for the chariot to stop and to wait for them, because it's only the king in the chariot. Laius is quite an accomplished charioteer, as anyone David points out, familiar with the complexities of Greek mythology will be familiar. And David says, without getting into all of that here, let's just say that he's quite an accomplished charioteer, and he doesn't need, right? He doesn't need a driver or an assistant, to conduct his chariot for him, and he prefers, at this point in his life, at least David says, at this point in his life, he prefers to drive, his own chariot, and to do so, without, an accompanying assistant or companion, and so Laius, the naked Laius is in his chariot, and the only thing he's wearing, David points out, is his crown, and which he doesn't seem to be able to give up. But other than that, he's naked and he's in the chariot, and the only thing that his entourage, is wearing are their variously, are their swords, and this, can create, some kind of humor, David points out, because, the swords, sort of clatter around, and if the actors are particularly skillful in the depiction of their, the illusion, that they're running forward, they'll often, bump into one another, and if they're wearing their swords on opposite sides, suggesting, perhaps, that one is real left-handed and one is right-handed, but these swords will, clang into one another and create these, distracting noises, and then the actor playing the part of Laius can look back and, annoyedly and perhaps, make suggestions that, they be more careful. They all want to arrive, at the Tripleus of aCiPhtTh intact, and David goes on, but these actors have to be particularly skillful at this, because they have to appear that they're running forward, but they have to run. They actually have to run a bit backwards occasionally to give the appearance, because the chariot can't go forward, right? Because of the setup, of the design of the stage. David points out that the chariot can't go forward, or it'll intrude upon the stage space that represents Oedipus moving in the opposite direction, and that would be odd. And it might be funny, David says, but it would create an interruption that would conflict with the movement forward of the dramatic action. And so these actors, have to perform this motion in which, they appeared, and he's like moving his hands up and down, describing the motion, in which they appear to be moving forward, and here he's advancing forward. But in fact, he says, but in fact, they're in the space-time in which, they're performing on the stage, they're actually moving backwards, and this creates the illusion, or one could say the deception, the physical deception, right? The illusion that they've fallen behind, and this allows Laius, to stop, or to the actor, right, to the actor playing Laius, to mime or pretend to create the illusion that he's no longer moving forward. And at this point, when the actor playing the character of Laius, David explains, right, signals that he's going to, stop the movement forward of the chariot, right, then this has to be coordinated, right? And this has to be coordinated with whoever it is that is operating the motion of this background, that's creating the illusion that everyone is moving forward. And so that when the wheels of the chariot, come to a halt and the horses driving the chariot stop, that background has to stop as well in order to, create that illusion that Laius and his chariot is waiting, for these runners who have fallen behind, and are now, closer to the edge of the stage, than they were, prior, when they were, right behind the wheels of that chariot, right? And David says, and so all of this is part of the illusion, right? The illusion of the motion forward, but to create this illusion, one has to master all of these elements of symphonia, right? And coordinated action. And the illusion itself, and then David, he kind of creates a meta-narrative moment here. He says, the illusion itself is something like the illusion of narrative. We have this idea that it's linear and sequential, and that perhaps this is the way that it works, and it unfolds, naturally, and casually, like the way that I'm, moving my hands. But in fact, to create that illusion, of this continuity, in space and time, and the synchrony with the movements that are coinciding with the motion on the other side of the stage, right? This coordinated, effort, has to be made on all of the parts of those involved in the performance to create that illusion. And the construction of the illusion, right? That belongs to the story, and as we're describing it here, this is just a story. This isn't a narrative in the sense that I define narrative. But all of this is a matter of symphonia. Just like, right? Just like montage or collage is a matter of symphonia. And the aesthetics involved, in the putting together of the montage, whether the intentionality, is to construct an illusion, right? An illusion of whatever it might be, the unfolding of events in space and time, or the illusion of semantic, coherence, or the rupturing, of a semantic, coherence. All belong to this muse, if we want to, and David says if you want to use, the word muse, all belong to these principles of symphonia, organization, arrangement. And so every once in a while, these actors, will start to, these naked actors on Laius's side of the stage will start to lag behind, or create the illusion that they're lagging behind. And Laius will stop and wait for them to catch up. And on this side of the stage, there's, as we've already stated, there's a sign, and it says this way to the tripleus amoxitois, which David refers to as crossroads. And after Laius waits for his entourage to catch up with him several times, which is and David says, and when I say it that way, you understand that it's an abbreviation and it's a reification of all of these sets of illusion that create this representation. But even to say it that way, I have to spend a lot of time. He says, say it in a way that doesn't reify it and reify the illusion. I've got to spend quite a bit of time. So you understand in storytelling that you're always engaged in these complex operations of rhetorical deception and arrangement and symphonia, illusion, the construction of illusion in creating a story, whether it's a narrative or non-narrative story, David says. And but generally, unless all of those aspects of the symphonia become part of the metapoetics of the narratology, they remain in the background and can be referred to as an inventory, right? An inventory of devices of the illusion, of the cohesion, and linear integrity of the story itself, right? And that's what storytellers do, and that's what both narrative and non-narrative storytelling does, David says. So at some point in the movement forward, and while David says, and while Oedipus is still walking toward the tripleus amoxitois, which he refers to as crossroads, but while he's still walking toward the tripleus amoxitois, and the sign on his side hasn't changed, on Laius's side, there's some kind of a device on the sign, and it suddenly changes. And again, all of this has to be coordinated or arranged as a symphonia. And as soon as that sign changes, that says this way to the tripleus amoxitois, and now suddenly says Daulis toward Delphi, or whatever it is that it says, David says, as a director of this particular play, one has a certain degree of freedom and options, because otherwise it wouldn't be interesting if you just did it the same way every time, right? If you do the same thing every time, it becomes boring after a while, David says. But you could say, here you are, or you could say, you have reached the crossroads, or it could say Daulis toward Delphi, or it could even say, tripleus amoxitois, although it would be boring in a way if it said this way to the tripleus amoxitois, and now you just get tripleus amoxitois, but something snappy, so that it's funny, because this is a comedy after all. And the sign changes, and it's comical. And suddenly, when all of this has to be arranged and coordinated. But suddenly, when the sign changes, Laius's chariot has to stop, and the runners, who are only pretending to run forward, now have to pretend that they've stopped, right, and create the illusion that they're no longer running. Well, they aren't running, so that illusion is a little bit easier to create than the illusion that you're running forward, or the more difficult illusion that you're running forward when in fact you're running backwards, right? David says. So this is relatively easy on their part. An easy, coordinated, aspect of the Symphonia on the part of the actors, or easier than that other one. And of course, at that same moment, once again, the backdrop has to stop unfolding, so that we know that we're not moving forward, because it'd be weird. Now, he says if there's a little bit of asynchrony here, that can produce humor. But for a director, you gotta try that, all of that out, before you implement it, because it could turn out that it's funnier on sync, or it could turn out that it's funnier out of sync. But you got to experiment with that, because under different conditions, being in sync is funnier than being out of sync. And then under other conditions, being out of sync, and he's moving his hands all over the place, so it's hard to sync with them here, I guess, as a demonstration that, of being in and out of sync. And he says, so you got to experiment, and it's different in different situations, and this is part of the process of realizing all of this, as David says, a symphonia, right? Because whether it's in sync or out of sync, you're trying to maximize, what's funny. And if you choose, the wrong solution set, and you choose wrong solution sets too many times, then you're really mitigating, the pleasures, the potential pleasures that you have in performing this story as a comedy. So a good director, takes all of that into account. And so David says, so effectively, all of this is coordinated in such a way that the chariot, the noises of the chariot cease, because they're not really coming out of the chariot. That's all an effect as well. And the noises of the chariot cease, and he's hiding his hands, like because we've stopped, I guess. And the movement of the chariot wheels cease, and the movement of the horses cease, and the backdrop stops unfolding, and the runners, stop in their movement forward, and everything halts right on that point, presumably. If it turns out to be funnier in sync, David says, right on that point where the sign changes and says whatever it says that's the funniest exclamation for saying it. You've arrived. You're here. Or Daulis toward Delphi. Maybe an exclamation point on the sign. Whatever it is. Whatever's funniest, and whatever's the most comical. And all of that happens, and then they just sit there, David says. And we know they're waiting. They're waiting for Oedipus, and he's still marching forward. He's still marching forward in his armor, which is kind of a surprise, because we expected him to be naked, right? David points out we expected him to be naked. That was part of the that was part of what the future Laius revealed to Laius, so that he could form his schedule plan, so that he could form his plot, his plan, his scheme, schedule, so that with this scheme they could engage in the drasi, which they're supposed to be engaging in. But now they've come to a halt, and the drasi isn't moving forward. The action isn't moving anywhere, but Oedipus is still marching toward the crossroads. and the sign, still is pointing in the direction of the crossroads, and Laius is three naked assassins, are just standing there waiting, and Laius is in the chariot, standing there waiting, and they stand and this goes on for a long time. David says this goes on for a really long time. It becomes tedious. They're just standing there waiting. And sometimes, Laius will crawl out of the chariot and sit on the ground. And sometimes, his entourage, members of the entourage, will yawn, and they generally get, a laugh. And Oedipus, just walking forward, and he's not taking off the armor, and he's still in his full armor, just walking forward. Sign still says, "This way the Tripleus aCiPhtTh," on his side. Still says Daulis toward Delphi, or whatever it says on Laius' side. And typically, David points out that a member of the audience will get bored and frustrated with all of this, and how long it is, and how tedious it is, and how long it's taking. He says it's taking nearly as long as it's taking for us to tell the story. He says, well, so, perhaps not that long, but it's taking a considerable amount of time, David says. And so the audience is bored and frustrated, and and their patience is being tested. And usually at some point, someone will call out from the audience, and this becomes the cue, for the actors, and usually someone will call out, and say, how long is this going to take? Or maybe you should move forward. And especially if someone has seen this play before, they'll suggest, maybe you can move beyond the Tripleus aCiPhtTh. He's on the road. He's closer to Corinth. Or whatever it is that they'll call out. And at this point, the actors, Laius and his entourage, will begin a conversation, and that conversation, typically goes, and there's, room for improvisation in the conversation as well. But the lines, as they're presented in as they're presented in the textual representation that we have, David says, of Aristophanes' play, The Smile of the Sphinx, begin with a conversation like this. I thought he was supposed to be at the Tripleus aCiPhtTh, one of the members of the entourage, the winners of the race. Whether it's the ordinary human, the king, the moth, the butterfly, the frog, the dog twice run over by a chariot, the fly tortured by a naughty boy, or whether it's the centipede, the millipede, the rhinoceros, the giraffe, the spider, the amoeba, whoever this particular winner was. And David says usually it's the stadion winner, who initiates the conversation, and that makes sense because the stadion winner is the short race winner, right? He won the one stage race, and so he's fast, but not necessarily patient, right? And then David says usually it's the two-stage winner that responds, to that initial comment, which is, I thought he was supposed to be at the Tripleus aCiPhtTh. At least that's the comment David says, that as it's written in the textual representation that we have, that's come down to us, from this history of recordings, right? Textual recordings of Aristophanes' play, and then it's usually the two-stage winner who responds to this. comment. I thought he was supposed to be there at the dry place of aCiPhtTh. And says, well, maybe we got here early because we took off all our armor. And then the Daulis, runner says, hey, that makes a lot of sense. I was excited because we were covering so much ground, he says. David says, he says. And then the one-stage winner, the stadion winner, because perhaps, he's the short distance runner and the least patient of them all, says maybe we should have kept on our armor until we maybe we should have kept our armor on until we got to the tripleus of aCiPhtTh. And then two-stage winner laughs, and the Daulis, winner, snickers, and wherever David says that wherever Laius is at this particular moment, whether he's in the chariot or whether he's resting on the ground or beneath the shade of some tree, as often occurs in Platonic dialogue, where a shade tree will represent the motivation to stop and rest. Wherever he happens to be, generally, he at this point, he turns and gives the three, winners of the races, a dirty look, and then that's the motivation for the discontinuing this dialogue. David uses the word discourse when he describes it. He says that's the motivation for discontinuing their discourse, but we'll just say that's the motivation for ending the dialogue here. And they're silent again, and they haven't moved forward yet. And Oedipus is still plodding along. And then this goes on for a long time again, generally, depending on the patience of the audience, and how long they can just, rest there in this manner, David says. But at some point, once again, whether it's a whether it's a real stadion winner from the audience or someone else, they'll call out again. Maybe you should move forward, or how long do you think it's going to take it? I don't think, or maybe they'll call. David says maybe they'll call attention to the fact that he's not really moving forward. Maybe it's just an illusion. He's not really moving forward, right? It's just an illusion. It's an illusion. His motion forward towards the tripleus of aCiPhtTh is really just a new. A sign's not going to change, right, until you go forward, right? So whatever it is, this is going to be a little complicated. I gotta go back. We're reaching the end here, right there. Let's see. All right, okay. And then they begin. The characters on Laius' side, once again begin the dialogue. And once again, it's the stadion winner who initiates the dialogue and says, in whatever polite way he says it, sir, and then Laius looks toward the stadion winner and says, yes, says, perhaps we should go on, at least to determine whether he's Oedipus, or he doesn't say Oedipus because Laius hasn't informed them. David doesn't make this error, by the way, I do. Laius hasn't informed them, who this is. Just that the stranger, this stranger is coming and he's a threat to the city of Thebes. Both citizens and the other residents of Thebes, and that he has to be destroyed, and that's their mission. And he's explained why they're naked, and they get all of that, and naked other than the clanking swords, that bang into one another occasionally and create this impetus for laughter and humor, but they don't know that the entire history. And he says he's a sort maybe we could move forward. And And Laius responds. It's supposed to take place at the Tripleus Amoxitolis. And he says, and then the two-state winner, at least as it's written in the textual representation that that's come down to us, of Aristophanes' play, The Smile of the Sphinx. Although there's room for improvisation, David points out, and changes that the director can make, in the dialogue, and then that's always the way things happen. Nothing is ever, just a matter, right, of performing as is, right? There's always negotiation. There's always transformation. Always a transformation and a negotiation. And even if one wanted, to do as accurately as possible, right? Just the availability of the materials, creates a situation in which decisions, have to be made about, what's going to be, what's going to be left in, what's going to be left out, how what's left in is going to be performed, and how lines are going to be distributed, and all of that, right? You could say that even if you did it, in the original Greek, in one way or another, a performance is always a translation. It's always a translation, whether you're translating it from one language to another. So if you think about it as a translation, you're better off than if you think about it as, a bijective function between the intentionality of this figure, this archaic, and classical figure, of Aristophanes and what you want to imagine today. Because stories are never like that. And if you only wanted to create a story that only responded, to this ancient time, then why would you do it today? David asks. Why would you perform it today? That wouldn't make any sense. If it doesn't speak to us now, then it doesn't speak to us at all, right? And so he says, so however it's written in the Aristophanes, however it's come down to us in this textual form, usually there's some play and movement in the way it's performed, and but the idea, in this conversation here is, well, what they're trying to decide is can they move forward? Can they move forward, or does the encounter have to take place here? And of course, the stadion winner, wants to move forward because he's impatient. And Laius doesn't particularly want to move forward because his design and his plot and his scheme, right, is all based upon this idea of a meeting at the Tripleus Amoxitolis, and he failed to account for some of the contingencies, and one of the contingencies is, and the characters, variously, express this. But the two-state winner says, I think without all that armor, we really got here a lot faster than we would have. I think we would have had a lot more stops, if we had been running in our armor. And the Delichos when I said, yeah, I agree. I don't think I've ever made such good time before. And then the stadion winner says, if we stay here too long, and then he addresses Laius directly. And he says, Laius, King, my king, sir, my king. However they address king, your royal majesty. I don't know how the Greeks address. David probably knows how a servant would address the king in ancient Greece, but I don't, and I can't recall exactly how David performs his mimesis of this part of the dialogue, but however it is, this character expresses this idea, of sort of ingratiating humility and and then points out, that they're I think there is no shade tree. I had suggested that there might be a shade tree, but I think that's again a failure of my memory, because and I hadn't really thought about it, but this part of the dialogue suggests there is no shade tree because the Stadion winner says, at this point, Your Royal Majesty or Sir or Your Highness or however it is that a servant addresses a king in ancient Greece in the most humble and respectful manner possible. Although certainly this king is not worthy in any way, shape, or form of such respect. But I think we'll be undoing. I think we'll be undoing your plan if we stay here any longer. See, this is a clever way of responding to or convincing, right? Engaging a narcissist and an egotist in discourse, David says, right? So he ingratiates himself and he says, I think we'll be undoing the point of your scheme, your plan, your schedule, if we wait here any longer, because sitting here or standing here under the heat of the sun in summertime, is effectively undoing, some of the work of your plan, which was to ease us, from the burden of the heat that we would experience in our armor, by removing it. And if we stay here too long and we're sunburned and hot and exhausted from standing, in the sun and waiting, he says, we're no longer resting. We're just experiencing this delay, as a burden, and if we get up and walk again, at least we'll experience the air, upon our bodies, and that'll cool us, and there may be shade trees up along the road further, and if there are perhaps we can rest there and wait once again, and he comes up with this elaborate argument. David says that effectively gets around this problem of the problem becomes the narcissism and the ego of this figure of Laius, right? Because he's come up with this plan, and he forgot a couple of points, right? First of all, he forgot that if they take off their armor, they're going to change the pace, and he should have figured that out, because now he's chosen on these fast runners. So he's got the fastest runners, which he wouldn't have had in his entourage if he hadn't developed this plan. So that's going to decrease the amount of time that it takes to get the tripleus amoxitoas, and then, beyond that, he's got these naked runners. So they're not wearing armor, so that's also going to decrease the amount of time that it's going to take to get to the tripleus amoxitoas. And then he's also forgotten that he's also forgotten that it's not in the nature of these young gymnastic runners, to sit around waiting, and because they're men of action, and belong, more to the spirit of the Drossi than they do to the schedule, or whatever else it might be, that symbolically determines the psychological function of that element of the unfolding of the story, that they're going to grow impatient, and that's going to become a problem. But the Stadio winner has offered him, this way out, it's like, which is that, it was a great plan. But we all forgot, to factor in, that we should have started, 4 or 5 hours later, and we wouldn't have known anyway. He says, who would know exactly? We didn't. In order to figure out the mathematical equation, the Stadion winner says, in order to figure out the mathematical equation, David says this is part of the dialogue at this point. In order to figure out that mathematical equation of how long, what the difference was, between that initial time. He said it would have been so complicated because we would have actually had to experiment, and done a trial run to the tripleus of aCiPhtTh, from the palace, and we would have had to we would have had to perform it, twice. We would have had to done the trial run first in our armor, and then recorded how long it took us to get there when we were all wearing our armor, and then we would have had to done it. He says, naked, like we did it, and to have done that, twice, and not to have died of heat stroke, or heat exhaustion here in the summer, it would have taken us at least 2 or 3 days, and then we would have had to, following the experiment, then we would have had to reproduce the result. David said, then we would have to reproduce the results of the experiment in exactly the same way. Of course, the temperature, might have varied, and that's another factor that you can't really control. You don't really have a control over all these contingencies. And so he says, you had a terrific plan, but all of these contingencies, become part of the way that we have to make adjustments, right? In any situation like this. And so it's not a fault of the plan, but just of the complexities of our world, right? And how we experience the phenomenon of weather, and we did forget, to factor in, how much faster we are in getting to the tripleus of aCiPhtTh. But let's not worry about it. Let's just go on. And Laius himself, David, notes is getting a little bored and anxious about all this. He wants to get on with the murder, right? He wants to get on with it, so he can return to Thebes and he can brag about it and he can feel secure and he can express, how masculine he is, and that he can't be defeated, and then David points again, to January 6th and Trump's initial election defeat and his refusal to accept it, and his inability to accept any form of criticism, and his eagerness, right, his eagerness to take over the presidency of the United States, following. So David points out that following his December declaration of his running for president once more in 2024, which we pointed out, David gets slightly wrong because Trump actually makes this announcement in November, but David's using future memory and things get confusing a little bit in future memory. So, we granted that, it's pretty close, right? And but that right after that, right? So he just makes his announcement, and David says at the beginning of December, 2022, which is actually, sometime toward the end of November, or middle of November, and then before even the middle of December, before even the middle of December, already he's claiming that we can throw out the Constitution, that he should become president of the United States once again, and in the middle, right, almost exactly in the middle of Biden's presidency. All right, so he's impatient, right, and if an idea comes to into his head, he wants to act on it, and this is part of and his impatience and sort of impoverished one could say poverty of self-control, right, is very similar, to Trump's poverty of the ability to control his actions and his deeds and his mind and his Twitter statements, right? Which and then David points out, which makes like the combination of Trump and Elon Musk an extraordinarily good element, it's not element, this is my error. An extraordinarily good argument, against social media, particularly in its Twitter forms, right? Like these communications in which like only the most ridiculous, sound bites and non-meditative, non-developed, discursive. You could hardly even call them discursive. David says it's like these. Like bits and pieces, like of information and expression, can be utilized in these future, social media domains. And this guy, like Elon Musk, who takes over one of these social media platforms, and then he talks about Twitter a little bit, right? Is like almost as impetuous and ridiculous a person as Donald Trump himself, right? And pretends that American democracy and freedom of speech is being navigated and argued on these platforms, when in fact, what he's really doing, is a public performance, of his own ego, and as an expression of his desire for attention and adulation on this platform that is the most ridiculously non-discursive platform that one could possibly imagine, right? And he goes on and talks about like the all of those unfortunate synchronies that occur, like to the unfolding of fascism in America in this period, between 2016 and 2024, and then we return, back to the impatience of Laius and his big ego and what informs his actions at this part in scene 3 in Act 2. The drug place Marx to us, and Laius, so he agrees. He says, "Let's go forward," and he gets back in the chariot, and as the chariot wheels, start to grind away, and the noise and rumble, and as the horses begin to move their legs, and as the naked, winners of the stadion, the two-state, and the dolichos, you start pretending to run forward and are often running back again. Then that backdrop begins to move on Laius' side once again, and Oedipus is still on the other side, just marching away. And usually, David says, we get a response from the audience at this point too, and they're like, they're excited about the fact that we're moving forward in the plot, and haven't, gotten caught in this just endless waiting, right? Like waiting for Godot. David compares it, to he says David goes, it's like a waiting for Godot without dialogue. Like if waiting for Godot, if you did like waiting for Godot and you threw out the dialogue, and so then he describes the movement forward and David says, and when all of this goes forward and is coordinated once again, again, the noises from wherever they're coming from, the symphonia of the noise of the chariots, the movement of the horses' legs, the movement of the wheels, the movement of the actors, playing the winners of the races, whether they're the ordinary human, the king, the moth, the butterfly, the frog, the millipede, the scorpion, the spider, the amoeba, the dog twice run over by a chariot, the fly tortured by a naughty boy, whoever they are, they have to coordinate it with all of this stuff, and the background has to, start moving forward at the same time too. And it does. And then as they're moving along, and as Oedipus is moving forward, but on the Laius side, as soon as they start moving forward, the sign changes once again. The sign on their side, but not the sign on Oedipus's side of the stage, David says. And the sign on Laius's side of the stage, is more or less, the same sign as it was when they were moving, toward the tripleus amoxitoas, which David refers to as a crossroads, but it's going in the opposite direction. So now it's exactly the same sign. I keep saying side, and I think that error is motivated by the fact that we're talking about signs, but we're explaining them on two different sides of the stage, in which they had been pointing toward one another as vectors, but now they're the same sign. Exactly, right? So the sign on Oedipus's side of the stage, which is pointing either right or left, is the same sign now on Laius's side of the stage, pointing in the same direction, meaning that representationally, on whatever side Laius is on, right, that he's moving away from that direction of the arrow pointing toward the tripleus amoxitoas. It's going in the other direction. This way, the tripleus amoxitoas is where we just were. And as the backdrops are unraveling, suddenly they sync up. And again, in the Symphonia, this all has to be arranged. And so that everybody has to coordinate their movements so that we can create this illusion that we're in the same space. And as soon as those, backdrops match up once again, and we know that because of this, the illusion tells us that Oedipus, has reached that point on the road in which Laius's chariot, is now directly in front of him. And his sign still says this way, to the tripleus amoxitoas, and Laius's sign still says the same thing. But now these signs, David says, they move forward toward the center of the stage. And Oedipus's sign, right, moves towards the center in one direction, and Laius's sign moves towards the center in the other direction. Until, these signs, one sign, effectively, blocks the other. So the illusion is created that the signs come together and form a single sign, right? And that's kind of funny. And usually that gets the laugh. But the signs are still pointing in the direction that, Oedipus had been walking, and they still say this way to the tripleus amoxitoas, David says. But it gets a laugh. And then of course the race winners are really relieved and excited about all of this, but they're kind of surprised that Oedipus is still wearing armor. And so the Delicios winner at this point says, I thought he was supposed to be naked. And then Sion, winner says, yeah, I thought so too. It's like, so what is he hiding? And David had put his hands, behind his back we're a little bit out of sync, but David had placed his hands behind his back, to suggest, what are we hiding? And he says, and then the Tuesday winner says, well, we're not hiding anything. We're naked, and then this gets played out, and the humor of like hiding and the use of we, which whoever utters that particular line meant what is Oedipus hiding, and it's like, well, we're not hiding anything, and he's like, no, we're not hiding anything, but what is Oedipus hiding? And of course he doesn't say Oedipus. He says, but what is the stranger hiding? And that was again my mistake. David doesn't say Oedipus here. He says, but what is the stranger? We're not hiding anything, but what is the stranger hiding? And because of the reference, right? The reference to male genitalia and all of that. It's funny and it usually gets a laugh. And then well, we're not hiding anything, but what is he hiding? And the dialogue goes on from there, and Laius at some point interrupts and says, can we please get on with this? We didn't spend all of this time preparing for this particular action to stand around and talking about who's hiding what from whom, and so so the winner of the Drasi takes out his sword and runs very quickly up to Oedipus who's still in full armor, and then they battle with swords, and Oedipus additionally has been carrying a shield on his back, and he's taken that shield off, and now and he has a sword, and so in addition to the legging armor and chest armor that he has, and the armor that he has on his forearms, he has a shield and he has a sword, and he quite easily dispatches the winner of the stadion. And then basically the same with the two-state winner, and the same thing occurs with the Dolichos winner, at which point, in spite of all of his bravado and feigned self-confidence and narcissism and pride, right, of masculine prowess and intellectual ability, which he doesn't in fact possess. In spite of all this, Laius, having observed that the three young and athletic members of his entourage were quite easily dispatched by the fully armored and shielded skills of Oedipus, doesn't have time, because Oedipus is basically upon him already, and at the reins of the horses of the chariot, and Laius doesn't have time to spur the horses forward and to turn the chariot in whatever direction that it wouldn't be facing Oedipus, and leaps from the chariot, and perhaps he's just panicking, David suggests, but he leaps from the chariot, and at this point in the scene, and runs, and he's running back in the direction of David says it's kind of funny because he's running back in the direction of the Tripleus and Moxitois. And then David also points out that often a member of the audience has become kind of a fashion, like in like, the way that these elaborate performances had become fashionable, but kind of set in a way, right, and predictable in the cult following, for the Rocky Horror Picture Show, right? So that there were particular lines, that were repeated at a certain point, and perhaps in the beginning of this exchange, between the audience and the film, film as motivation for performance art, a certain sense, and audience engagement and participatory involvement. Perhaps at a certain point it was improvisatory, but then it became set, and then there would often be a kind of MC or narrating figure or director, and the audience generally knew which lines to repeat and how to respond to certain lines, and it became conventionalized in a certain way, and fixed, David says, and in this moment, in scene 3 of Act 2 is a bit like that. There's become conventional for the audience to say which way to the tripleus amoxitoas, as Laius is retreating, back on the road, toward the tripleus amoxitoas. So it's at this point that Oedipus, throws off, his armor, and keeps only, his sword, and nude or naked, runs, after Laius, and this chase, David says, lasts, quite a while. And the chase is performed in that direction in the same manner that the unfolding background represents movement. In the other scenes, only the background is unfolding continuously on both sides of the screen, and then there's a continuity, right? So we understand that we're in the same space, but both backdrops are unfolding, in the same manner, and representing a movement toward the tripleus amoxitoas, and the actor playing Laius and the actor playing Oedipus, David explains, are both pretending to run forward, and the illusion of their motion is carried by this background. David says that's the illusion, and then that sign in the middle that's now, that was once two signs, that's now one sign, changes once again, and it says whatever it says for maximum comedic effect. It says, you've arrived, or you're here, or welcome to the tripleus amoxitoas, or Daulis at Delphi, toward Delphi, whatever it is that sign says, for maximum comedic effect. David says it suddenly changes, and the backdrop, that's in motion suddenly stops moving, and Oedipus catches up to Laius, and they're both naked, just like in all the prophecies and dreams. And Laius appears to become aware of the irony of all of this planning and scheming when he realizes that he and Oedipus are at the tripleus amoxitoas, and they're both naked, and only Oedipus has a sword. And Oedipus takes out his sword, and very quickly, and without much effort at all, dispatches dispatches this tyrant, who in fact is his father, but of course, whom he is unaware is his father. And then this usually gets having killed Laius, he wipes he wipes his the blood from his sword, David says, onto his leg, and he does so, and David says this usually gets a really big laugh. He does so with these strokes that somehow leave, on his leg, written in blood, the Greek, the numbers, as they are, expressed and written in Greek, 4, 2, and 3. And he says, and we clearly see, them being written as he's wiping the blood, onto his leg. David says. Then first we see the 4, and then we see the 2, and then we see the 3, and then after following that, he puts his sword back in its scabbard, and then pretends to move forward, and that illusion once again is carried by the movement of the screen in the background, and the body of Oedipus, excuse me, that was my mistake. The body of Laius, is carried off the stage by the movement of this mechanical movement of the stage itself, right, which creates the illusion that we're leaving this body behind as we proceed forward, in the movements that Oedipus is making toward Thebes, and of course towards his encounter with Diarmenia Sheshapunk. And so as this mechanical apparatus moves the body of Laius to one side of the stage, and the illusion of Oedipus' movement forward toward Thebes is largely now carried out by the unfolding of the background, and David says, and as he begins, sort of like self-satisfied, whistling, some kind of pleasant tune, then the lights once again fade, and the audience applauds, generally satisfied that the terrific action at the finale of the scene was worth waiting for, and worth sitting through all of this boring, right, this boring lengthy part of the performance, in which David once again refers to it as like a kind of like waiting for Godot without the dialogue. And so he says that it would seem that the satisfaction of the audience and the applause at this point is perhaps more a matter, David says, more a matter of delight than it is of joy or pleasure. But whether it's a matter of joy or pleasure, typically, once again, there's a standing ovation, just prior to the outset of Act 3, Scene 1,